Alrighty, whenever we're ready.
Here's the first question. Hi, Ben. Nice to meet you. I'm Peter.
Nice to meet you.
So I go to high school right over at E.O. Smith, and a lot of my friends, liberal. It's a pretty liberal atmosphere. They're kind of talking about like Germany being better in economic growth, being better with controlling inflation, things like that, and how we should emulate them, do something like the EU. I was just wondering what your thoughts on that are.
I mean, the EU is failing, so that's economically illiterate. The fact is, the United States is by far the world's powerhouse economy. It will continue for the foreseeable future to be the world's powerhouse economy. It drives the entire economy of Europe, too. We paid their defense bills for something like 50 years, so that helps as well. Germany had to, I mean, they took austerity measures like 4 years ago. They had to cut back on their social programs. Angela Merkel got in hot water with her own party and with a lot of the voters specifically because of this. So the idea that Germany has a stronger economy than the United States, there's always somebody who's saying somebody else has a stronger economy than the United States. Like 5 years ago, people were saying China has a stronger economy. 20 years ago, people were saying Japan has a stronger economy. The answer is no, no, and no. The United States has far and away the strongest economy in the history of the world.
Hello, Ben. My name is Martin.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. I'm not really a fan, but I like hearing you talk.
You know what? Thank you for showing up specifically because you're not a fan.
Right. I like hearing you talk. So one of my questions is, you talk about this culture between black and black violence. What is your solution then to that?
Don't commit crimes. I mean,
I feel like there's a bigger issue.
I mean, my broader solution really is that these communities require more police, not less. There's a woman named Jane Levy who writes for the LA Times. She's actually on the left, and she wrote an entire book about how a lot of the disparities in crime, particularly in black communities, were due to racism, but not in the way that we think of racism, like white cops going in and beating people up in black neighborhoods, but because white people basically said to black neighborhoods, take care of yourself. Right? And if there's high violence in your areas, then you take care of it yourself. Well, that leads to higher tribal levels of violence in any society, right? Whenever there's not an enforcement mechanism in place to actually stop crime, then the crime rates go up. And in fact, you know, the broken windows theory in New York City has saved an enormous number of black lives because the police were actually present and active. You need more active, present police hunting down people who kill other people. That's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that you actually need fathers who stick around. This is true in white communities and black communities. One of the great tragedies of the last 4 decades in the United States is that the single motherhood rate has risen not just in the black community from 20% in 1960 to over 70% now, but in 5% in the white community to over 40% now. That's a huge jump in both communities. Young men particularly do need a male influence there to curb them. As a man who was once young, I can attest to this. So I think that that's another aspect. And obviously, once you actually lower the crime rate, then you're going to get more economic growth. This is what's happened in particular areas of New York, where once the police were actually able to go in and shut down crime in particular areas, then suddenly businesses could come back in. They weren't afraid of being robbed. And suddenly people were willing to live in those areas who weren't willing to live before. This is gentrification, and gentrification is a good thing. Right? The left has opposed gentrification by suggesting that, oh, it's people throwing people out of their historic homes and all this nonsense. The fact is that if the quality of life in an area gets better, not worse, that seems to me an undeniable good. Right? So if the area gets better, that's gentrification. If the area stays crappy, it's ghettoization. I mean, there has to be some solution. You can't just claim that when things get better, that's racism, and when things get worse, that's racism also. Right, so the reason that New York City has gotten better is because of increased policing. So increased policing, a cultural focus on fathers staying in the home and mothers not bearing children out of wedlock, and an individual commitment not to commit crimes.
So just following up real quick after that, so would you say the solution then is to improve education in that sense, teaching these people early on to stop doing these things?
I mean, I honestly don't think that the quality of the educational system is heavily connected to crime. Just because I don't think that schools are the folks who teach people not to kill each other. I think that's usually your parents. So I think that the quality of schools is more a reflection of the poverty of neighborhoods than it is the cause of crime rates in neighborhoods. I think it's more of an effect than a cause, in other words. Great. Thanks so much.
Hey, Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
My name's Jaron. Just had 2 quick questions for you. 1, how do you think it will play out if Oprah actually runs for president? And 2, can I grab a selfie with you?
So I'll have to ask security about the selfie since I'm not in control of my own fate anymore, unfortunately. But as far as the Oprah running for president question, I don't think it's going to work out the way she wants it to. So there's a poll yesterday that came out, Trump versus various Democrats. Against Joe Biden, I think it was 57-40. Against Bernie Sanders, it was like 55-40 in favor of the Democrats. And then against Oprah, it was 51-42. So she was polling worse than Biden and Sanders. The reason that I think that she'd be in trouble is because, number one, I do think she'd win the primaries, because I think it'd be very hard to defeat her in a primary. But I think that in a general election, here's the thing about Trump. Trump is basically made of mud. What I mean by this is that if you're a politician, the worst thing that can happen to you is someone throws mud on your skirt, right? Suddenly you were pristine, and then someone throws mud at you, and you're dirty. Trump is a mud monster. You cannot hit him with anything, right? I mean, literally nothing. I mean, in the last 2 weeks, we found out that he probably paid a porn star $130,000 not to talk about an affair that he had with her when he was married to Melania and his son had been born 4 months ago, and no one cared. Okay, that right there is the sign of a candidate who you can do nothing about, right? What that means is that Trump is never going to be a 60% guy, but he can be a 45% guy because he's already gotten 45, 46%, and that means that he can duplicate his performance of last time, and nothing you say about him can drag him down. Oprah is almost the opposite. So Oprah starts off at 51%, but that's because everybody thinks of Oprah as kind and wonderful, and everybody loves Oprah, yeah. And then it'll turn out that people will start digging into the school that she ran in South Africa for years, and that had 2 separate, pretty brutal sex scandals against children. Or they'll start digging into all of the weird health conspiracy nuttiness that she's done on her show. And the minute that people start actually tossing mud at her, because she's considered angelic, that mud shows up on the white skirt a lot better than it would show up on Trump. So I think that she would be a lot weaker, a stronger candidate in the primaries than people think, a weaker candidate in the general than people think.
Good evening, Mr. Shapiro. It's a pleasure. Big fan. My question has to do a little bit with Jordan Peterson and the recent hysteria with, Canada's Bill C-16.
Yes.
With the compelled speech law, right? I just want to know, do you think that there's anything to worry about in America as far as compelled speech goes, government overreach?
Yes. And so I think that anti-discrimination laws are going to be used as an excuse to crack down on religious institutions and people who disagree. So the way this will happen, because that's what Bill C-16 is. It's an anti-discrimination law. The idea is that you are discriminating against people if you do not use the proper pronoun. Right? This already exists, by the way, I believe, in New York City. The New York City Human Rights Commission passed an ordinance that will fine restaurants like $250,000 if they do not address a patron by the pronoun that person wishes to be addressed by. I don't know how that stands up to the First Amendment. I really don't. But that also requires a Supreme Court that's willing to implement the First Amendment. And so that depends a lot on whether Justice Kennedy has had his bowel movement that day. It's impossible to predict whether Justice Kennedy is going to go one way or another on any particular issue. I do see this happening in California. There was already an attempt to strip the Boy Scouts of their 501c3 status in the state of California because the Boy Scouts weren't allowing gay scoutmasters. You could certainly see something very similar happening if they refuse to address people by particular pronouns, or if a church or synagogue refuses to perform a same-sex wedding. They can say, okay, well, you have a nonprofit status, but you're violating our view of what should happen with regard to marriage. The state now recognizes marriages between men and women and women, so we're going to remove that status from you. I think that we're moving pretty quickly in that direction. That's where the left clearly wants to go. The only question is whether the constitutional barriers will be strong enough to prevent it.
Do you think they are?
Again, I think that it depends. I think it's up to us. I don't rely on the Supreme Court to protect the Constitution because it historically has done a pretty poor job of it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shapiro, for being here. It's truly amazing that you were able to come. My name is Justin, and I have one question for myself and one for my brother, who unfortunately couldn't be here. He asks, what actual actions that Trump has taken do you like and think are beneficial?
So there are a bunch of them. So I've actually been asked to grade Trump on policy before, and I say is that on executive policy, I give him an A-. On legislative policy, I give him a C. It would have been a D except for the tax bill. And on rhetoric, I give him an F. Because, I mean, I like complete sentences. But when it comes to his policy, I mean, Justice Gorsuch is great. The cuts in regulation are great. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem is great. The tax bill is really good. The attempts to take land out of the hands of the federal government and open it up to development is a very good thing. Half of the land in the West is owned by the federal government and run by the federal government. The new religious freedom regulations that he's promulgating in HHS, all of these things are very good things. So I think that on policy, he has been quite good, at least as far as he can do it with a Congress that's so fractious. again, on rhetoric, because I think where he's done the most damage. And I will say this, in evaluating Trump, I don't just evaluate him on policy. So I think a lot of conservatives want to say, his policy is good, so why aren't you happy? And the answer is, I'm happy with his policy. Right? But being the president is about more than policy. It's also about, can you help build the social fabric? Can you make America a place that is more unified, not less unified? Can you make the country a better place to live because people don't hate their neighbors? And on that score, I don't think that the president's done a very good job at all. I think on the score of the policies that I like, he's done great.